12 years ago, Madison walked out on Ryan Carter because he couldn't give her the life she believed she deserved. She left behind their small apartment, their quiet evenings, and a man who loved her more than she ever gave him credit for. What she didn't take, what she never once glanced at, was a tarnished pocket watch sitting in the back of a dresser drawer, the only thing Ryan's grandfather had ever left him. For more than a decade, that watch gathered dust while Ryan scraped together enough to survive. Then one afternoon, he opened it, and everything changed. Stay until the very end to discover the secret hidden inside that watch, the secret that changed Ryan's life forever. Ryan Carter and Madison Sullivan had been inseparable since their sophomore year at Ohio State, two people who found each other in a crowded lecture hall and decided, without much deliberation, that they belonged together. They were married at 24 in a small ceremony at a rented event hall, surrounded by family and friends who toasted their youth and wished them well, and for a brief window of time, life felt exactly as it was supposed to feel. Ryan had a plan, not a glamorous one, but an honest one. He had spent his adolescence watching his grandfather restore timepieces at a narrow workbench in the garage, and somewhere between those quiet Saturday afternoons and the smell of machine oil and aged brass, he had decided that was what he wanted to do with his hands and his life. He enrolled in a horological apprenticeship the same year they married, choosing craft over corporate ladder, choosing patience over ambition, or at least, over the kind of ambition Madison had always quietly admired in other men. The first few years were survivable. Ryan brought in enough between repairs and part-time work to keep them in a modest apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and Madison worked as a dental office receptionist while she figured out what she actually wanted. But as time moved forward and their peers began purchasing houses and taking vacations to places with sandy beaches and blue water, something in Madison began to shift. She had grown up watching her mother count quarters before grocery trips, and she had made a private promise to herself somewhere along the way that she would never live like that as an adult. Ryan was kind, and Ryan was steady, but Ryan was not making that promise easy to keep. The arguments began slowly, almost gently, and then escalated into something uglier. She would hold up a credit card statement and ask him to explain why they were still eating at the same diner they had been eating at for 3 years. He would tell her things were temporary, that the shop he was saving for would come together, that his skills were growing. She would put the statement down without saying another word, and the silence between them would last for days. Ryan picked up weekend work repairing appliances for a neighbor, then took a second job delivering packages for a local courier company 3 mornings a week, but none of it moved the needle in a way that satisfied her. Madison began spending more evenings at her sister's house, coming home later and with less to say. She stopped asking about the watches he was working on. She stopped laughing at the small, dry jokes he made over dinner. There was a hollowness that settled into their apartment, a kind of quiet that was nothing like the comfortable quiet they used to share, and Ryan felt it with a clarity he didn't know how to address. He didn't know how to be someone other than who he was, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. On a Thursday evening in late November, the rain came down in sheets against the windows, and Madison stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat already on. She had packed 2 bags. He hadn't noticed them until that moment, and her voice was flat and certain when she spoke. She said that love did not pay the electric bill. She said she was 31 years old and she was not going to spend the rest of her life wondering whether they could afford a new mattress. She said she was sorry, but she wasn't, not really, and Ryan could hear the difference. He stood in the living room with his arms at his sides and watched her pick up the bags, open the door, and walk out into the rain without looking back. She took what little they had saved in their joint account, $940, and she was gone. Ryan sat on the couch for a long time after that. The apartment felt enormous in a way it never had before, and the rain kept going, indifferent and relentless. He didn't cry right away. He just sat there and listened to the water and thought about how quickly a life could hollow out. When he finally got up to start boxing his things, to begin the process of reducing their shared life into 2 separate halves, his hand landed on something cold and small at the back of the closet shelf. A pocket watch, dull and rust-spotted, tucked inside a folded handkerchief. It had belonged to his grandfather. He had forgotten it was there. The next morning, Ryan brought the pocket watch to 3 different shops across Columbus, carrying it in his jacket pocket like it might mean something. The first jeweler turned it over in his hands for less than a minute, told him it was old stock, no recognizable hallmark, no notable maker's name, and handed it back without ceremony. The second shop owner was only marginally more thorough, running a loop over the casing before shaking his head and quoting a value that wouldn't have covered a week's groceries. The third appraiser, an older woman who specialized in estate pieces, was at least kind about it. She told Ryan the watch was probably manufactured in the mid-1900s, that the movement was competent but unremarkable, and that while it might carry sentimental value, it was unlikely to fetch anything meaningful at resale. Ryan thanked her, put it back in his pocket, and drove home. When he got there, he opened the top drawer of his dresser and set the watch inside, beneath an old utility bill and a book of stamps. Then he closed the drawer. He spent the following weeks pulling himself out of the wreckage of his marriage with a methodical quietness that surprised even him. He found a smaller apartment on the east side of town, single room, low ceilings, a window that faced a brick wall, and he paid first and last month's rent with money borrowed from a friend. He applied for a business license, negotiated a short-term lease on a narrow storefront 2 blocks from a bus stop, and opened a watch repair shop he called Carter's Time. The sign he painted himself on a Saturday afternoon, crouched on the sidewalk with a brush and a can of dark green paint. The shop was barely wide enough for a workbench, 2 stools, and a glass display case he'd bought secondhand from a closing gift store. He hung a string of white lights along the window edge because the overhead bulb cast a yellow that made everything look older than it was. Business was slow in the way that nearly invisible things are slow. Days went by with one customer, sometimes none. There were mornings he counted out exact change for a gas station coffee and walked the 4 blocks to the shop with the particular determination of a person who has no real alternative but to keep going. He learned to cook rice and black beans in large batches on Sunday nights, portioning them into containers that lasted through the week. He didn't complain about any of it, at least not out loud. The work itself was the thing that held him together, the precision of it, the way a damaged movement could be understood and corrected through careful attention, the way time could be made to work again with the right tools and the right patience. He was good at it. Not famous, not prosperous, but genuinely, quietly good. Gradually, a handful of loyal customers found their way to Carter's Time. An elderly man named Walter came in with a broken chronograph his late wife had given him and left an hour later with it ticking perfectly, unable to stop thanking Ryan. A retired schoolteacher brought in 6 watches she'd been storing in a shoebox, convinced they were all beyond saving. Ryan fixed 4 of them. Word moved slowly through that kind of neighborhood, passed between people who valued reliability over spectacle, and by the end of his 2nd year, Ryan had a small but faithful clientele of older residents who trusted him with things that mattered to them. He still wasn't making enough to call himself comfortable, but he was no longer counting bus fare at the end of each week. He had found a kind of equilibrium. Not happiness exactly, but something close to peace. One afternoon, while reorganizing his workbench, Ryan pulled the old pocket watch out of his coat where he had started keeping it out of habit, a small, wordless gesture of continuity, and set it next to his tools. An hour later, a man he had never seen before walked into Carter's Time, spotted the watch from across the room, and went very still. The man's name was Samuel Whitmore, and he was in his mid-70s, with the kind of deliberate, unhurried movements that belong to people who have long since stopped rushing toward anything. He had come in to have a pocket watch of his own cleaned. A rather fine piece, Ryan noted, probably pre-war Swiss manufacture. But the moment his eyes landed on the tarnished watch sitting beside Ryan's magnifying lamp, his entire demeanor shifted. He set his own watch down on the counter without handing it over and leaned forward slightly, studying Ryan's piece with an intensity that felt out of proportion to what was, by anyone's account, a fairly unimpressive object. Ryan watched him for a moment before asking if he recognized it. Samuel didn't answer right away. He picked up the pocket watch carefully, turning it over in his hands, examining the case with the focused attention of someone reading a document rather than admiring an antique. He asked Ryan where he had gotten it. Ryan told him his grandfather, Marcus Carter, had left it to him when he died, along with a few tools and a small collection of books on horology. He had always assumed it was something his grandfather had bought cheaply somewhere. Samuel set the watch back on the counter, and Ryan noticed that the older man's hands weren't quite steady. There was something behind his eyes. Not excitement, not curiosity, but something closer to recognition mixed with unease, and it made Ryan sit up a little straighter on his stool. What Samuel said next was not what Ryan expected. He told Ryan, quietly and with complete seriousness, not to sell the watch. He said it twice. He said not to show it to strangers, not to mention it to dealers, not to let it out of his sight if he could help it. Ryan asked him why. Samuel pressed his lips together and said only that the watch was not what most people would think it was, and that certain people, if they learned it existed and knew who had it, would not behave well about it. Ryan asked again what he meant, and Samuel shook his head once, the way a person does when they have already said more than they intended. He paid for the cleaning of his own watch in cash, counted out the bills with slow precision, and tucked his wallet back into his coat. Before he left, he placed a business card on the counter beside the register, plain white cardstock, his name printed in simple black type, and a phone number with a Columbus area code. He told Ryan to keep the card somewhere safe. Then he walked out. Ryan stared at the business card for a long time after the door closed. He picked up the pocket watch and turned it over, running his thumb along the worn case, looking for whatever it was Samuel had seen in it, and finding nothing that he hadn't already found. It looked exactly like what 3 appraisers had already told him it was, an old, unremarkable timepiece of minor historical interest and negligible market value. He put it back on his workbench and told himself that Samuel Whitmore was probably eccentric, that old collectors sometimes attached stories to objects the way other people attached memories to photographs. He went back to work. He didn't call the number on the card that week, or the week after. He kept meaning to in the distracted way that one keeps meaning to do things that don't feel quite urgent enough. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, a woman came into the shop, not a regular customer, someone he hadn't seen before, and asked whether he knew a man named Samuel Whitmore. Ryan said he did, that the man had been in recently. The woman looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately place, and then she told him, in a voice that was measured and careful, that Samuel Whitmore had died 4 days earlier. The cause had been listed as cardiac arrest. He had been found alone in his home. Ryan stood behind his counter and said nothing for several seconds. He thanked the woman, who turned out to be a neighbor of Samuel's who had come to collect his watch. She left without lingering, and Ryan stood there in the empty shop and looked at the business card still propped against his register. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Carter's time, addressed in Samuel's handwriting, postmarked the morning before he died. Ryan did not open the letter immediately. He set it on the workbench beside his magnifying lamp and spent 20 minutes finishing a repair on a woman's wristwatch before he allowed himself to sit down and break the seal. Samuel's handwriting was small and careful, the letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone who had grown up in an era when penmanship was considered a form of character. The letter was 2 pages long, written on stationery so old it had yellowed slightly at the edges, and it began without preamble or pleasantry. Samuel wrote that he had not been well for some time, and that there were things he needed to put on record before he no longer could. He explained that the pocket watch Ryan had shown him was not merely old. It was specific, historically documented, and tied to a lineage that most people believed had been permanently severed. He told Ryan that there was a mechanism in the watch that was not visible from the outside, a secondary compartment built into the rear casing that could only be accessed by pressing 2 small recessed points simultaneously, one near the crown, one near the hinge, while applying slight upward pressure to the back plate. He said that inside that compartment, Ryan would find materials that would either mean nothing to him or change everything, depending on who he asked about them. Ryan set the letter down and picked up the watch. He spent the better part of 20 minutes finding the 2 pressure points Samuel had described. They were nearly invisible, disguised as part of the decorative etching on the case, and when he pressed them together and pushed upward, the back plate gave a soft, mechanical click and a hidden panel slid open. What he found inside was not dust or empty space. Folded into the thin cavity, with the delicate precision of origami, were 3 items: a fragment of paper that appeared to be a partial map of some kind, hand-drawn in faded brown ink with markings he didn't immediately recognize, a sequence of letters and numbers written in a cipher-like arrangement on a strip of cloth-backed paper, and a name, written clearly in a different hand on a separate slip: Harrison Whitmore, 1948. Ryan stared at the items for a long time. His first instinct was skepticism. It felt theatrical, the hidden compartment, the mysterious name, the coded sequence, like something out of a film he wouldn't have chosen to watch. He photographed everything with his phone and sent the images to a lawyer he had met once at a community legal clinic, a woman named Charlotte Hayes, who specialized in estate law and had given him her card after helping him navigate a small landlord dispute. He wasn't sure why he contacted her specifically, only that she had struck him as someone who approached unusual situations without flinching. Charlotte called him back within the hour. She asked him to come to her office. When he arrived, she had already pulled something up on her laptop, and her expression as she looked at the photographs was not the skepticism Ryan had half expected, but something more careful and alert. She told him that Samuel Whitmore had been, before his retirement, one of the most respected private collectors of horological artifacts in the northeastern United States, known in certain circles for his near-encyclopedic knowledge of timepieces tied to significant historical estates, and that he was not, by any account she could find, the sort of man given to fabrication or dramatic storytelling. If Samuel had gone to the trouble of writing that letter, she said, then what was inside that watch mattered. Charlotte pulled up a probate database, cross-referenced the name Harrison Whitmore against estate records from the 1940s and 50s, and within 15 minutes was looking at a thin digital file that made her set down her coffee cup and go very still. She told Ryan that the Whitmore name was connected to a family that had once held substantial assets in the American Midwest: property, industrial holdings, financial instruments, and that the family had essentially vanished from the public record around 1951, leaving behind a set of unresolved claims and a number of assets that had never officially transferred to any inheritor. She looked at Ryan over the top of her laptop screen and said that if the watch was what she was beginning to think it was, then the 3 items folded inside its hidden compartment might be the most important things he had ever touched. What followed was 6 weeks that Ryan would later describe as the strangest of his life, which was saying something given the 12 years that had preceded them. Charlotte moved with the focused efficiency of someone who had been looking for an interesting problem and had finally found one, pulling records from county archives, state libraries, and federal databases with the methodical energy of a person who genuinely enjoyed the work. Ryan sat across from her in her office on 3 separate evenings, watching her assemble information the way he assembled movements, piece by piece, each component placed in relation to the others until a coherent mechanism began to emerge. What they found, slowly and then all at once, was this. Harrison Whitmore had been a prosperous industrialist based in Cincinnati during the 1940s, a man who had made a significant fortune through a combination of manufacturing contracts and real estate holdings. He had one surviving son, a man named Edward Whitmore, who had left the country in 1951 under circumstances that were never clearly documented. Some records suggested immigration, others suggested financial trouble, others said nothing at all. Harrison had died in 1953 without a legally executed will on file, at least not one that had ever been entered into probate. His estate, which, according to stock certificates and property deeds they found in a Cincinnati county archive, was considerable, had been placed in a kind of legal suspension, managed by a succession of administrators who had gradually, over the following decades, dissolved what they could and filed away the rest. The key detail, the thing that made Charlotte set down her pen and lean back in her chair, was a provision in a set of trust documents they found attached to a 1949 banking record. Harrison Whitmore had established a secondary arrangement for the protection of his estate in the event that his primary will could not be executed, a conditional transfer, tied to the possession of a specific personal item he had identified by description and serial number. The description matched the pocket watch. The serial number, etched inside the main case in characters so small they required a watchmaker's loupe to read, which was exactly why Ryan had never noticed them, matched perfectly. Ryan's grandfather, Marcus Carter, had worked for Harrison Whitmore as a skilled craftsman during the late 1940s. Charlotte found his name in a payroll ledger from 1948, listed among a small group of specialist tradespeople Harrison had kept on retainer. The watch had passed from Harrison to Marcus during that period, almost certainly deliberately, and Marcus had kept it for the remainder of his life before it passed to Ryan. The lineage of possession was unbroken, and in the context of the conditional transfer documents, unbroken possession by a named associate's direct descendant carried legal weight that Charlotte found both extraordinary and, after careful review, entirely defensible. The night Ryan drove home from Charlotte's office after that third research session, he noticed a car parked across from his apartment building that he didn't recognize, a dark sedan facing his building, and when he slowed to pull into his parking spot, it pulled away from the curb without its headlights on. He told himself it was nothing. 3 days later, he arrived at Carter's time to find the front lock scratched, the door slightly ajar, and the small back office clearly searched. Drawers pulled open, folders disturbed, the filing cabinet's bottom drawer removed from its housing. His repair equipment was untouched. His register was untouched. Only the shelf where he had kept his printed copies of Charlotte's documents had been disturbed, and those papers were gone. He called Charlotte from the sidewalk outside the shop, standing in the thin November light. She told him to come in immediately and to bring the watch. She also told him, for the first time, that she had not been entirely forthcoming about something. In the course of her research, she had reached out to a professional contact who specialized in estate authentication, a routine step, the kind of thing she did in complex cases, and that contact, she now believed, had mentioned the inquiry to someone else. The information had traveled further and faster than she had intended. Someone out there now knew that Ryan Carter, a watch repair shop owner in Columbus, possessed a pocket watch that might be the key to a dormant multi-million-dollar estate, and that someone had already decided they wanted it. The man who arrived at Carter's time 2 days after the break-in did not look like trouble, which was, Ryan supposed, the point. He was well-dressed, a dark wool overcoat, a watch on his wrist that cost more than Ryan made in a year, and he came in the way wealthy people often come into small shops, with a casualness that was itself a kind of display. He introduced himself as Connor Blake, said he was a private collector, and made it sound like a social call. He admired the tools Ryan had arranged on the workbench, asked a couple of knowledgeable questions about a Swiss repeater Ryan was in the process of servicing, and then, with the same easy tone, told Ryan that he understood he was in possession of a rather unusual pocket watch, and that he would be interested in making an offer. Ryan said nothing for a moment. He kept his eyes on the watch he was working on. He asked Connor how he had come to understand that. Connor smiled and said that word traveled in collecting circles, that it always had. He named a number, $200,000, and set it on the counter between them like an object rather than a figure. Ryan set down his tools, looked at Connor directly, and said no. Connor's expression did not change. He said he appreciated directness and that he could do better. He said $500,000, in the unhurried tone of a man who had access to considerably more than that, and knew Ryan knew it. Ryan said no again, and this time he said it without looking up from the movement he had returned to examining. Connor remained standing at the counter for a moment longer than was comfortable, as though giving Ryan the opportunity to reconsider, and then he straightened his coat and said that the offer would remain open and that he hoped Ryan would think carefully before making any decisions. He left a card, heavier stock than Samuel's, embossed lettering, and walked out. Ryan picked it up, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, and put it in the trash. Charlotte, when Ryan told her about the encounter that evening, was not surprised, but she was serious. She told him with some clarity that what Connor Blake had offered was a fraction of what the watch's actual legal significance warranted. She had been running calculations based on the trust documents and the current estimated value of the assets referenced in the conditional transfer provisions, and the numbers, even conservatively applied, were not modest. The pocket watch, in the context of the estate claim Charlotte was now preparing to file, was not a collectible. It was a legal instrument. And legal instruments with the potential to unlock dormant estates on the scale of the Whitmore holdings were not things that should be traded for whatever a well-dressed man in a wool overcoat offered on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 days after Connor's visit, Ryan received an anonymous message, a typed note slid under the door of the shop, that said simply, "Sell it while the offer is still there." He photographed the note and sent it to Charlotte, who forwarded it to a detective she knew through a previous case. The detective said it was likely posturing, designed to create enough anxiety to push Ryan into a hasty decision, and that the best counter to it was exactly what Ryan was already doing, nothing rash. Ryan agreed, but he moved the watch from the shop to a small safety deposit box at his bank that same afternoon, keeping only a high-resolution photograph in its place. Charlotte, meanwhile, had found something new. In a box of administrative records digitized from a Cincinnati courthouse archive, scanned at low resolution, indexed inconsistently, the kind of file that existed purely by bureaucratic accident, she had found a reference to a sealed storage unit registered to the Harrison Whitmore estate in 1951. The unit's contents had never been inventoried. The cipher on the cloth strip inside the watch, when applied to the address notation in the map fragment, pointed directly to its location. They had a destination. The next step, Charlotte told Ryan as she closed her laptop, was to open it. The vault was in a storage facility on the west side of Cincinnati, a 3-story building that had been a bank, then a warehouse, then a record storage company, and was now operated by a small real estate management firm that had acquired it along with a portfolio of commercial properties in the 90s. The firm's property manager, a tired-looking woman named Deborah who had worked there for 11 years, led Ryan and Charlotte through a dim corridor on the building's lower level, past rows of numbered metal doors, to a unit at the far end that was secured not with a standard padlock but with a mechanical combination lock of considerable age, the kind that required a specific sequence to engage rather than simply a numerical code. The cipher from the watch provided that sequence. Charlotte had spent 2 evenings working through it, and when she stood in front of the vault and entered the combination, the lock disengaged on the first attempt. The unit was small, perhaps 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and inside, arranged on metal shelving that had survived the decades in better condition than anyone had a right to expect, was a collection of materials that neither Ryan nor Charlotte was fully prepared for. There were 3 large binders of stock certificates, each share representing ownership stakes in companies that had been operating in the 1940s and 50s. Some of those companies had long since dissolved, but others had been absorbed into corporations that still existed, and the shares, if the ownership chain could be legally established, represented claims against those successor entities that made Charlotte's eyes widen considerably when she began to assess them. There were property deeds for parcels in Ohio and Indiana, several of which, when cross-referenced with county records Charlotte accessed on her phone, covered land that was currently occupied by commercial developments, land that had never been formally conveyed out of the Whitmore name. There were handwritten letters, a dozen at least, bound with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity and crumbled when Charlotte touched it, so that the letters fell loose into her hands. They were addressed to Edward Whitmore, Harrison's son, and they read as a father's attempt to communicate something urgent to a child who had already left. The final letter, dated March of 1951, was explicit. Harrison had known he was unwell, had known his formal will was incomplete, and had taken what he described as precautionary steps to ensure that his estate could be claimed by the right person through an alternate chain of evidence. The watch, he wrote, was the key. The vault was the lock. And the rightful claimant would be whoever could demonstrate unbroken possession of the watch through a verified personal connection to his household. Ryan read that final letter twice, standing in the narrow space of the vault with the overhead fluorescent light buzzing faintly above him. His grandfather's name was on a payroll ledger. His grandfather had been given the watch. His grandfather had kept it, passed it to his son, and his son had passed it to Ryan. The chain was not complicated. It was, in fact, remarkably clean for something that had been waiting 70 years to be found. Charlotte told him as much in the careful, measured tone she used when she was trying not to sound more excited than the facts warranted, though her excitement was visible. She said that what they had in front of them constituted a legally actionable estate claim, that the process of establishing it would take time and require verification at multiple levels, but that the evidence was strong and the documentation was, in certain critical respects, almost unusually well preserved. She also said something else. She said that in her professional estimation, the total value of the assets referenced in the documents they had just found, the stock claims, the property interests, and a number of financial instruments whose current status would need specialist assessment, was not small. She paused before giving him a number, the pause of a person making sure they had done the arithmetic correctly. Then she said that, conservatively, the recoverable value of the estate assets could exceed $1 million by a significant margin, and that some of the property claims, if they held up against current ownership challenges, could push the total considerably higher. Ryan sat down on the floor of the vault with his back against the shelving, the binders of stock certificates beside him, and he did not say anything for quite some time. Outside in the corridor, the fluorescent light above the door flickered once and steadied. News, in the age of accessible public records and fast-moving journalism, does not stay quiet for long. Charlotte had filed the preliminary estate claim through the appropriate county probate channel, which became part of the public record in the way that legal filings always do, and within 10 days a local reporter had picked up on the case and published a short piece in a Columbus business newspaper, a modest article, factually careful, that described a watch repair shop owner who had discovered a significant dormant estate claim tied to a pocket watch he had inherited from his grandfather. The piece was picked up by a regional wire service within 48 hours. Madison saw it on a Thursday morning while she was on her lunch break. She was working now as an administrative coordinator at a commercial real estate firm in Columbus, had been for the past 4 years, and she was living in an apartment in the Short North neighborhood with a boyfriend who drove a nice car and took her to decent restaurants and was, by most observable measures, exactly the kind of man she had once decided she needed. She saw Ryan's name in the headline, and she sat very still for a moment before reading every word. She called Ryan that afternoon. He didn't answer. She called again the following morning, and this time he picked up, and the silence between her voice and his was something neither of them quite knew how to break. She said she had seen the article. He said yes. She said she thought it was wonderful what he had found, that she had always known he was special. Ryan stood in his shop, watching a repair he had set aside cooling on the workbench, and said nothing to that. She asked if they could meet for coffee. He said he had some time on Saturday. They met at a cafe he had chosen because it was close to the shop and had nothing sentimental attached to it. Madison looked the way she had always looked, put together, careful in her presentation, nothing left to chance, and she had brought with her a kind of carefully practiced warmth that Ryan recognized as the warmth people deploy when they are asking for something they suspect they don't deserve. She talked about the years, about things she had thought about regrets she had accumulated in ways she framed with just enough vulnerability to seem genuine without going so far as to be uncomfortable. She touched the rim of her coffee cup the way she used to when she was building towards something. She said she had wondered, a lot of times, whether she had made the wrong choice. Ryan let her talk. He was not unkind about it, that had never been his nature, but he was present in a way he perhaps had not been during their marriage, with a clarity about what was happening and why that 12 years of solitude and honest work had given him. When she paused and looked at him with an expression that contained the beginning of a proposal he had no intention of accepting, he spoke. He said he understood what she was saying and that he held no anger toward her. He said that the end of their marriage had been the hardest thing he had ever gone through, and that it had also, eventually, been the thing that taught him he was capable of standing alone. He said that if she had stayed, he was not sure he would have ever found that out. He said it without cruelty, but without any ambiguity either. Madison sat back in her chair, and for a moment her composure came slightly undone. Not dramatically, just enough that Ryan could see the real emotion underneath the calculated warmth. She said, "If I had stayed that night," he said, "then we would have been miserable together, and that would have been worse for both of us." She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once quietly, and didn't say very much after that. They parted on the sidewalk with a handshake that felt strange and correct at the same time, and Ryan walked back to his shop in the cold afternoon air with a lightness that surprised him. The following week, Charlotte informed him that the estate authentication had progressed to the stage where an international auction of the watch could be organized, both as a means of establishing its historical significance beyond dispute and as a mechanism for realizing part of the estate's value. The pocket watch of Harrison Whitmore would be offered at public sale. The horological world was already watching. The auction was held on a Saturday in March at a venue in New York City, a converted Beaux-Arts hall in Midtown with high ceilings and good acoustics and the kind of lighting that made everything inside it look more significant than it would in ordinary daylight. Charlotte had engaged a specialist auction house whose reputation in the field of historically significant timepieces was effectively unimpeachable, and they had spent 6 weeks marketing the event to collectors and institutions on 4 continents. By the morning of the sale, the room was filled with the particular quiet tension of people who had come a long way and intended to leave with something. Gabriel Foster was there. He was a man of 60 or so, with white hair and the formal bearing of someone who had spent decades being taken seriously in rooms like this one, and he had flown in from Geneva specifically because the watch was, in his considered professional opinion, the kind of piece that came to market perhaps once in a generation. He had examined the watch the previous afternoon in a private viewing arranged by the auction house, and he had emerged from that session with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they had hoped, but not quite dared to believe. He told the auction house representative, quietly and on the record, that the Harrison Whitmore pocket watch was not simply a fine example of mid-century American private commission horology. It was the only remaining physical documentation of a commission that had been considered lost, a watch whose historical significance extended well beyond its considerable mechanical quality. He had seen photographs of this watch in correspondence from 1948. He had spent 12 years believing it no longer existed. Ryan sat in the third row, in a suit that Charlotte had suggested he purchase for the occasion, and watched the room fill with people who inhabited a world very far from the one in which he had spent the last 12 years. Connor Blake was there too, seated near the back, making no effort to conceal himself, watching Ryan with an expression that was unreadable but not particularly friendly. The auctioneer took the podium at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and described the piece in terms that Ryan had now heard enough times to recognize, but that still landed strangely when applied to the object he had kept in a dresser drawer for a decade. Bidding opened at $250,000. It crossed $500,000 in under 4 minutes. At $800,000, 3 of the initial bidders had dropped out, and the room had gone very still in the way rooms do when the numbers become real rather than theoretical. Connor Blake entered at $800,000, his paddle raised with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested he had prepared for this number. A telephone bidder, a collector in London, Charlotte had mentioned, who had sent a representative, countered at $900,000. The auctioneer's voice remained steady and unhurried, and Ryan gripped the edge of his armrest and breathed. $1 million. The number settled over the room for a moment like weather. The telephone bidder moved to $1,100,000. Connor Blake raised his paddle, 1,300,000. Gabriel Foster, who had been sitting quietly in the front row with his hands folded, raised his own paddle for the first time, 1,500,000. The room exhaled. Connor Blake hesitated. Ryan could see it from where he sat, the fractional pause, the calculation happening behind the man's eyes, and then raised his paddle again, 1,700,000. Gabriel Foster did not hesitate, $2 million. A silence lasted approximately 4 seconds, and in that silence the room felt very large and Ryan felt very small in it, and then the auctioneer struck his gavel. Connor Blake did not raise his paddle again. The telephone bidder was silent. The hammer came down at $2 million, and the room erupted in the controlled, restrained applause of people who express astonishment at a volume consistent with good breeding. But the auction was not, as it turned out, the final word. As Ryan stood in the reception area afterward, Charlotte appeared at his elbow with a legal pad covered in notes and an expression he had come to associate with news that would require him to sit down. She said that the estate authentication, which had proceeded in parallel with the auction preparation, had concluded that morning with a determination that significantly expanded the scope of what was being recovered. The property claims had held. The stock transfer chain had been verified by 2 independent forensic accountants. She said he should find a chair. The full accounting of what Ryan Carter inherited from the Whitmore estate, mediated through the conditional transfer provisions, the estate claim, and the auction proceeds, took Charlotte the better part of 3 months to finalize. The figure she presented to him on a Tuesday afternoon in her office, printed on 2 pages of legal paper with careful annotations in the margins, was not a round number, which somehow made it feel more real. The auction proceeds of $2 million were the smallest component. The property holdings, 3 parcels in Ohio and 2 in Indiana, all appraised at current commercial value, added another $4 million across the total. The stock certificates, assessed by a specialist in successor entity claims, represented interests to companies that had been absorbed into publicly traded corporations, and those interests, calculated against decades of accrued value, amounted to a further sum that Ryan had to read 3 times before the digits arranged themselves into something his mind could hold. The total net of legal fees and processing costs and the considerable administrative expense of establishing a claim of this complexity was somewhere north of $8 million. Ryan sat in Charlotte's office with the 2 pages in his hands and the afternoon light coming through the window and the very ordinary sounds of a Tuesday in Columbus outside. Traffic, a delivery truck, someone's dog, and he felt something he would describe later not as joy exactly, but as a kind of deep structural relief, the feeling of a person who has been carrying weight for so long that the absence of it is almost unfamiliar. He paid off what little debt he had accumulated over the 12 years. The business loan, the apartment lease he had broken when he first moved, a medical bill from 2 years prior that he had been chipping away at methodically, and the total of it came to just under $14,000, which in the context of what he now had felt almost comical. He set aside a significant amount in a financial trust that Charlotte helped him establish, managed conservatively, the kind of fund that generated income without requiring him to think about it constantly. He paid off his shop's lease in full for the next several years. He had the front window repainted, the signage updated, the interior reconfigured so that it was less cramped and better lit. Then he did something that surprised the people who knew him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He established an apprenticeship program, a formal, structured one attached to a technical institute on the south side of Columbus, that offered young people, specifically those aging out of the foster care system, a 2-year training track in horological craft and small business operation. He funded it fully, named it the Marcus Carter Apprenticeship in honor of his grandfather, and spent 2 afternoons per week teaching there himself. The first cohort was 8 people. By the 2nd year, there was a waiting list. He also did something else that was less publicly visible, but that meant more to him. In a small town in central Ohio where his grandfather had grown up, there had once been a watch repair shop. Marcus Carter's original shop opened in the 1950s and closed when Marcus retired in the early 1980s, the building long since converted to other uses. Ryan tracked down the building's current owner, made a straightforward offer for the storefront space, and spent 4 months renovating it himself on weekends, bringing in craftspeople he trusted for the structural work and doing the interior finishes with his own hands. He reopened it as a working repair shop and historical display, with a small room in the back dedicated to the story of the Whitmore estate claim and the pocket watch that had unlocked it. School groups came. Older residents who remembered Marcus Carter came and stood in the doorway and told stories Ryan hadn't known. He listened to all of them. The pocket watch itself had been purchased by Gabriel Foster at auction and gone to a private collection in Geneva. But before it left the country, it had been loaned for a 2-week exhibition to a horological museum in New York, and Ryan had attended the opening. He had stood in front of the display case where it sat under carefully calibrated light, on a velvet mount beside a printed card that described its provenance and significance, and he had looked at the object that 12 years of other people's disinterest had kept in his possession long enough to change everything. Madison, he heard through a mutual friend some months later, had ended her relationship and moved to another city. He hoped, with the quiet and uncomplicated generosity that had always been the most consistent thing about him, that she found what she was looking for. He didn't think about her often, and when he did, it was without bitterness. Only a kind of muted recognition, the way one thinks about a weather pattern that passed through long ago and reshaped the landscape before moving on. She had left him because she could not see value in what he was. He had spent 12 years becoming more of exactly that thing. If there was justice in the story, it was not the loud, satisfying kind. It was quieter than that, and more complete. At the museum opening, Ryan stood in front of the display case for a long time. The card beside the watch was printed in simple black type on white stock, and at the bottom, below the provenance details and the historical notes, was a line he had written himself when the museum curator had asked whether he wanted to contribute something. It read, "Sometimes the thing that changes your life is not the thing you went looking for, but the thing you were patient enough to keep." He read it once, standing there in the quiet of the museum with people moving around him in that hushed, reverent way that people move through places where old things are honored. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and walked back out into the world that was waiting for him, unhurried, unadorned, and entirely his own.